5 tips to help you take better group photos. So let's jump right in. So tip number 1, you want to stagger your group, and that's both horizontally and vertically. Now, depending upon how many people you have, if it's a smaller group and you can fit them all in one row, then definitely put them in one row because it will make it easier from a focus perspective. But if you have to have multiple rows, you definitely want to stagger them horizontally. So you want to make sure that you can see everyone's face. What I like to tell people is when you're looking in front of you, there should be 2 shoulders in front of you. So if there's a head in front of you, you need to adjust. But it also helps to stagger them vertically as well if you can. Now, that's not always possible. Sometimes you don't have anything that they can stand on or sit on to be able to do that. But if you can do that, it's going to make for a much more pleasing group shot. So stagger your people as best as you can. Tip number 2 is you want to keep them tight and cozy. So you want to get them in as close as you can, and you also want to make sure that they're as close in from front to back. Now, keeping them as close as you can front to back is going to minimize the amount of depth of field that you're going to need to be able to get everyone in focus. So you definitely don't want to have a lot of space in between people from row to row. But also side to side, you want to get people in close because you want the group to look cohesive. The more space you have in between people, subconsciously, we feel like people don't want to be together if they're not close. So although for some people it can be uncomfortable and they definitely like their personal space, for group shots, you want to get people in as close as you possibly can. It really will make the shot look better. And from a technical perspective, it's going to help you a lot. Tip number 3, you need to figure out what aperture you need to be at. Now, your aperture is going to play a big factor in your depth of field. Now, depth of field in general is determined by quite a few things: your focal length, how much distance you have in between your subject, and your aperture. So you want to make sure that you can get your subject from the front all the way to the back in focus, and your aperture is going to play a big factor in that. Now, there isn't a one size fits all. There is no aperture that's going to work for you. But in general, if you're going to be having just one row, obviously you have the flexibility to use whatever aperture you want. If you have 2 rows, you're going to be somewhere between f4, f5.6, 3 rows on average f5.6 to f8. And then as you get more rows, you increase from there. Now, you may be thinking, well, why not just shoot it like f16 or f22 to give me the most depth of field that I possibly can have? Now, that is an option if you want to do that, but there are a couple problems with that. Number 1 is diffraction. I don't really want to get into that in the video because it's kind of some scientific stuff, but just know once you get past a certain aperture, you start to actually have a more softer image than you do sharp. So going to f22 is not going to yield you a sharper image than f8 due to diffraction. So that's number 1. Number 2, if you're in a low light situation, arbitrarily shooting at f16 or f22 is just not a good idea, because now you're going to have to either bump up your ISO, you're going to have to slow down your shutter speed, use more light. So it doesn't make sense to arbitrarily shoot at an f16 or an f22 if you don't have to. Now, the great thing is depth of field is a fairly scientific thing. So you can use a depth of field calculator. There's a ton of them. There's apps for them. You can use a depth of field calculator to figure out exactly where you need to be with your aperture based off of your camera, your focal length, how much space you have. You can figure out where you need to be, and it doesn't take a lot of time to do. So I definitely recommend that you utilize a depth of field calculator. It's much better to take 20 seconds before you take the shot to make sure you're good than to take the shot, think that you're good when you look at it on the camera, and then you get it in post or you get it on the computer, and then you realize your poor folks all the way back here in the back are out of focus, or they're more soft than they need to be. So definitely utilize those depth of field calculators to figure out what you need there. Now, a couple of things to consider as well. You may hear that people will say use a wide angle lens because you get more depth of field with a wide angle lens than you do a telephoto like an 85. But when it comes to group photos, that really isn't true. You really will have the same amount of depth of field with a 35 as you will an 85 when you take into account how much further back you have to be with the 85 to be able to frame it exactly the same as a 35. Your depth of field is going to be about the same. So you're not really getting any more depth of field using a wide angle than you would a telephoto, considering the distance changes. So Your true factor in figuring out your focal length really has to do with how much space you have. If you're shooting with an 85 and you have a big group and you've got to be 25 feet back to be able to frame them, obviously if you don't have 25 feet at your disposal, that's not going to work. So a 24 or a 35 or maybe a 50 would work better. So that's where your focal length really plays a factor. Don't think about you're getting more depth of field, you really aren't. The second thing to keep in mind is that on average, people take up about 1.5 feet of space, considering their body and a little bit of space in front and a little bit of space in back. So you can use that to determine roughly how much depth of field you need. So in this case, I have 3 rows. So if you take 3 rows, multiply it by 1.5, that's going to give you 4.5 feet. So if I'm using the depth of field calculator, I know that I'm going to need roughly 4.5 feet worth of depth of field to be able to get everything in focus from the front to the back. So that's just a general guideline. Obviously, depending upon the size of the people and how close you can get them together, that may shift a little bit, but that's a good ballpark figure. So take however many rows you have, multiply it by 1.5, and that's going to let you know how much depth of field you're going to need. Tip number 4 is to pay attention to where you're going to focus. Now, a mistake that a lot of people will make when they're shooting group photos is they're going to focus right here on the eye of the person in the front, because people tend to think that your depth of field is going to start where you focus and then move to the back. But that actually is not true. Now, this isn't going to be exactly the same all the time. It's going to depend upon your focal length and how far you are away. But on average, in general, 1/3 of your depth of field is actually in front of your focus area, and then the other 2/3 is behind that. So when you're focusing, when you have a group of people, you actually don't necessarily want to focus on the front person. You really want to focus 1/3 of the way into your frame. And where I like to focus is actually on the ear of the person. So in this example here, where I have 3 rows, 1/3 in would really be like this second row, but I'm not going to focus on the eye of the people in the second row. I'm going to focus on the ear of the people in the front row. So that way I'm going to utilize that 1/3 that's in front of my focus area to make sure the front row is in focus. And then I can use the remaining 2/3 to make sure the back rows are in focus. So no matter how many rows you have, you want to try to get your focus point, your focus plane, 1/3 of the way into your frame. So then that way everything is going to be more sharp. If you focus on the person in front, you're going to have a harder time getting everyone in the back in focus unless you have your settings in a way to where you have enough depth of field behind your focus point to do that. Now, that's fine if you can do that, but it doesn't make sense to basically throw away 1/3 of your depth of field. So just remember, on average, focus 1/3 of the way in. Tip number 5 is to utilize the inverse square law if you have to use off-camera flash. Again, if you don't really know what the inverse square law is, that's okay. The only thing you need to know is that the closer the light is to your subject, the quicker that light is going to fall off. The further away that light is from your subject, the slower that light is going to fall off. So when it comes to group photos, you don't want to make the mistake of having a light really close to your subject, because what's going to happen is your front row is going to have great light. Your middle row is going to have decent light, but then that light's going to fall off and your back row is going to be dark and in shadow, and that's not going to be pleasing. So the way to work around that is by moving your light back. So that way the light that's hitting everybody is going to be an even light and everyone is going to be illuminated fairly equally. Now, the downside, I say downside, but the thing that you have to accommodate with this is that because you're putting that off-camera flash further back, you're going to need more flash power. So typically a speed light is not going to be the best choice when you're trying to light a group, because you're going to need so much power. Now, you may be able to work around it, but you may have to be at full power, which is not going to be the most convenient due to recycle time. So if you're going to be shooting groups, you really are going to want to have something at least like an 8200 to be able to light your scene, and having that light back far enough to be able to light everybody. You also want to take into account how many you need. If you have a smaller group and they're in tight, you can use one light, kind of place it more in the center, and that's going to light everybody. The wider you get, the more you're going to want to have 2 lights, sometimes even 3 or 4 lights, depending upon how big the group is, to be able to light everyone evenly. If you have a wide group and you have just one light off to the side, even if you move that light far back, depending upon how wide the group is, you're still going to have fall off, and the opposite side is going to be in more shadow. So you just have to take into account how wide is the group, and then that'll kind of dictate how many flashes you need. But the most important thing is utilizing that inverse square law, pushing that light back so that you get even light on your subject. And to round it out, a couple of bonus tips. You want to take a lot of frames. The bigger the group, the likelihood of you getting everyone looking at the camera, eyes open, expressions good, and one frame is slim to none. So you want to take multiple shots, more than you think you would need, so that way you can assure that you have exactly what you need for everybody that's in the frame. And then you can just take that into Photoshop, and if there's someone that has eyes closed, take their eyes that are open from another frame, stitch those in. I typically would try to find the frame that kind of looks the best and has the most amount of people how I want them to be, and then I'll fix the rest of the people from that. So take a lot of frames. Also, you want to make sure you move quick. People's attention, it fades very quickly, especially with group photos. Most people don't really have a desire to do group photos. So the longer amount of time you take, the more you're going to lose people. They're not going to focus. They're not going to want to smile. They're not going to want to be there. They may leave. So you really do need to move quickly. And that's why group photos tend to be so stressful, because there's a lot of things that you have to pay attention to. There's a lot of things you have to make sure are correct. There's a lot of camera settings you have to make sure is correct. You've got to pose everybody. You've got to make sure everything is good, and you've got to do it in a very short amount of time. So group photos do tend to be very stressful, but it is important to move quickly.